tonight's lesson is going to be the 15th lesson in the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim. And I wanted to go ahead and give a shout out while the recording is running, because I know there's many more students who listen to the recording than are able to actually log in live. And so just to let you know, if I've seemed unresponsive for the past week or so, it's because I've been working to finish a Becky book on Esther before Purim, which is a tall order. Purim is racing upon us. And if I'm to get this prepared before the online conference in South Africa, and not just to get it formatted here and uploaded, and also South Africa is a completely separate thing. It has to be done differently so that I'm not violating my own copyright. And so it has to be two different books, even though it's the same book. And so right now, I'm probably a good halfway done. And the hard part is done. I'm getting up to the easy part now. So if I know you guys just kind of flooded me last week with emails. And so I responded to a few, but the rest of them are pretty much just sitting in the inbox. And it's not that I'm trying to ignore you, it's just that I have to in order to get this done. I got my dissertation done by locking myself in a hotel room for 3 days. So, and only one person knew where I was at that time. So if you can just give me this week, the rest of this week, to get this book finished, edited, laid out, and then sent off to the other readers and editors, then I can hopefully get it back into our good class routine, hopefully by next week. And so I'm just asking you for a pass. If I don't respond to you, or don't give you more than a one-word answer on an email, that's what I'm doing. You haven't done anything wrong. It's me. All right, so let's get into the lesson, which would require me sharing the screen. And we kind of dabbled in this last Tuesday. We got right to the verge of it. And where did we go? We went from the tense of Kedar, because that's our context. This beloved, she's swarthy, she's black, she's like the tense of Kedar. And we looked at some of the different meanings behind the tense of Kedar, how they were nomads and how they moved from place to place, and how ultimately our promise is that we won't have to live like the tense of Kedar. We won't have to celebrate our feasts and going from place to place, not able to go up to Jerusalem, to the city of peace for the appointed feast. We won't have to fold up our tents, because that will be an everlasting cover for us. And that brings us into do not stare at me because I'm swarthy. The beloved has already stated that she's black or she's swarthy, but she's also lovely. She's given us that information, and she's not done clarifying what she means by I'm black, I'm swarthy. You can translate it either way, and either way is fine. But at this point, she's going to introduce an explanation. She's going to offer her own explanation as to why she appears to be darkened by the sun. And in this context, we might even add something into I'm black, I'm swarthy. We might also say I'm sunburned. I'm sunburned, because that's her explanation. She says the sun has burned me. So she's defining for us exactly what it means to be swarthy, to be shachor. And of course, we won't go into that. We're going to save these these last 4 points for next week. I just want to try to completely unpack, if we can, according to some of the tips that the Midrash gives us about the statement where she says, do not stare at me because I am swarthy. I want to lay that out because we just tipped into it at the very end of class last week. We just tipped into, what does it mean? Do not stare at me because I am swarthy. And I think it's very salient to us today because we are in such an internet age where our communications, it's not that I think they're that much worse than they've ever been before. Because if you look back, especially through American history, I mean, American history began with a riot. So riots are not new to Americans. They're still scary to us. Anytime you hear about a riot, yes, it should make you anxious. It should, be a matter of prayer. It should be a matter of, okay, let me discern my time that I'm in and what should I be doing? Because anytime there's violence in the land, that should concern us. But riots are nothing new. Evil speech is nothing new. I think it is reaching new heights. I think there's a particular fervor that has entered into the conversations. But if we look back at some of the conversations between our founding fathers, they were pretty intense. They had much more formal ways of calling each other names and, stupid heads. But, it doesn't matter how good or how bad your language is. It's the communication among brothers that's still the focus of this midrash, because remember, it's surprising how much the Song of Songs has been concerned with the return of the exiles. And what are the things that need to fall into place for the exiles to return and to do exactly as the prophecy tells us, where they would be so close that there would be you couldn't get a spirit in between them. They would be like the scales of Leviathan. And this particular part of the verse, which is verse 6, do not stare at me because I am swarthy, is related to the exiles. Now that part of it, we'll get more focused on it next week when we get into why is she sunburned? What exactly sunburned her? And why is it sunburn? And you can guess at what that one's going to be like. But before we get to there, there's a value judgment that needs to be made. This beloved comes in and people are staring at her. They're gazing at her. They're contemplating her because she's different. Now, we're not going to go yet to the fact that she's sunburned and why she might be sunburned. She's asking them, first of all, before I explain myself, I'm asking you, don't stare at me. Don't gaze at me. In other words, the look they're giving her is not good. It might be a look of disgust. It might be contemptuous. It might be, it can be all sorts of things, because the thing about a look is, a look transmits so much more than a word sometimes. It is, what's the saying? If looks could kill, I'd already be dead. Sometimes just the look on someone's face thunders above the actual words that they are using. Somebody might say, oh, it's so good to see you, but the look on their face is telling you otherwise. Or let's say I scold this crazy dog right here. All right, no matter what the words are coming out of my mouth, he's reading my face and my body language, and he knows I'm not angry with him at all, that I expect him to act that way. And it's perfectly fine. I just, for the sake of good form, we're going to object to the behavior, but he's a dog. So how you look at someone is the precursor to the words that you will form about someone. And the beloved here is trying to stop this, this potential of saying evil things at the point where people are simply looking at her unfavorably. It's a negative thing because she's feeling compelled to explain why she looks different than they do. So let's work with that a little bit. And of course, you know, we're continuing to take excerpts out of the Midrash as it pertains to these verses. Now, yes, I'm throwing stuff in there, especially when it has context in the Brit Chadashah. If I can clearly see a matching scenario or verse in the New Testament, I'm going to put it in there because we want to look at how it ties everything together. But I think over and over, we can see that a lot of the commentary here, it's right on because we're hearing it come out of Yeshua's mouth, or we're hearing it come out of the apostles' mouths. That's important because we want to verify that we're on the right track. And so when she says, do not stare at me because I'm swarthy, for the sun has burned me, they're pointing out that contextually, if you look at what she's saying, they are giving her a look of disapproval. And we don't know how severe the look is, but somehow she perceives it that you're disapproving of me, you're looking contemptuously at me. And so let me explain myself. Let me explain to you why I look the way that I do. And the Hebrew verb there for stare is one that you should be familiar with because it's one of the most common verbs, Hebrew verbs in the Bible. It's ra'ah, which means to look, but it has tons of nuances of meaning when you say just to look. So we have to look to the context to know, well, what kind of look is it? Does it just mean to look? Well, no, contextually, it's a disapproving look. And so the Midrash cites Proverbs 30:10 relative to this verse because they see the way that they're looking at her is a precursor to the words they might form concerning her. And they say, do not slander a slave to his master, or he will curse you, and you will be found guilty. And then they say, okay, who are the servants? Which in Hebrew, servant, slave, it's kind of interactive there. Aved, it just comes like a worker, and there's different degrees. It could just be a hired servant. It could be a literal slave, somebody who's been captured in war, somebody who's been bought with money. You would have to know the context to know which category that person fit into. But let's just assume that it's a worker. Maybe it's a hired worker. So don't slander, it says, a worker to his master, or his master will curse you and you will be found guilty. And our question is, well, what if the servant, what if the worker is guilty? What if he really did the thing that I saw him do? Well, Proverbs 30:10 doesn't address that. It just says, don't slander a slave to his master, or he will curse you and you will be found guilty. Now, what's the difference between slander and giving testimony? Well, a testimony would be a formal proceeding where if you were brought into court and you were asked, did you see so-and-so do such and such? Then under oath, you would have to say, yes, I saw that. I did see this servant, give away lumber to a passing person. Okay, it's some misappropriation. Yes, I saw it. And so under oath, yes, you would tell the truth. It's different than seeing something and taking it upon yourself to slander the slave to his master. And, well, Uzi, sweetie. Then it goes on, and we'll get more into that, because that's actually the meat. Like, what does it mean to slander a slave to his master? That's going to be the direction we're heading, because we want to be careful when we look at somebody who really is of our kind, but their appearance is much different from ours. Their journey has been much different from ours. Their journey has distinguished them. The sunburn they have experienced is maybe in a little bit different context than our sunburn. We tend to see other sunburn, but we don't see ours. And so we've got two examples here. Leviticus 25:55 says, the people of Israel are called servants, as it is stated, for the children of Israel are servants to me. And so if you think about it, if you serve the Holy One, then you are his servant. And so we need to be careful about slandering those who serve the Holy One. And then there's a second category. Amos 3:7 says, unless he's revealed his secret to his servants, the prophets. So the prophets are also servants. And with those two groups of people, we need to be very careful under what circumstances we slander them to their master, which is the Holy One. We're going to look at people sometimes and they're going to look different. Their habits might be different. There might be all sorts of things about them that are different. But be careful how you look, because how you look at them as you're contemplating their differences could lead to your speaking things about them aloud. And when you go into the heavenly court, I mean, like you say, the earthly court's one thing, but when you walk into a heavenly court and accuse that child, that servant, before his father, before his master, then you're on dangerous ground. And you as parents and grandparents know that. When somebody comes in and accuses your child or your grandchild, and I taught school, I know how this works. I've done parent-teacher conferences where I was told, well, my Raymond would never do anything like that. And I'm like, I had eyes on him when Raymond did something like that. So you have to be really careful when it comes to proceedings like that, where you have to give information about a child, or in this case, a slave, a servant, that the master or the parents may not want to hear. So they use the example here, which we've been kind of looking at the image of the beast now for several weeks. And in this context, they point something out. And then we'll go into, in this case, the slander was actually because the three Hebrew children were doing something good. But then we're going to go into cases where the people, which the Hebrew children were doing exactly what they were accused of doing, but for the right reason. But then we're going to look at a different scenario where it's not this. This is the easy one. This is the easy one to see. Well, like, yeah, this is real slander because they were innocent. I mean, of breaking heavenly law. They broke the law of the king, but they were obeying heavenly law. But we're going to extend it even farther out there. We're going to say, okay, yes, you know what? They're absolutely guilty. They're guilty not only of breaking the the covenant. They're doing it rebelliously. So here we're looking at the difference between obeying an earthly king, obeying a heavenly king. And so in Daniel 3:8, we know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were the only three out of all the representatives. And remember, these are pretty much delegates to the event that King Nebuchadnezzar, he's made his golden image. He's ordered that everybody's going to have to fall down and bow before the image to worship the image. And this we know is an iteration of the image of the beast. And so it says, for this reason, at that time, when everybody else falls down and worships the image of the beast, it says certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. Now remember, Daniel is primarily in Aramaic, which is pretty close to Hebrew. So, your root words, the Shoresh, pretty much going to be the same. It's going to be a lot of times the endings of things, the pronunciation of things, they might substitute like a Zayin for a Dalit in some case. But it's pretty much in the same family of language. So the accusation that they brought is going to be kratz. And some translations will say they slandered the Jews. So it's like kratz di Yehudia. Well, in Aramaic, it would be Yehudaeya or Yehudaye, I think. Sometimes it drops vowels when I cut and paste. At any rate, the word there is kratz, bringing charges, bringing accusations, slandering. And you say, well, how exactly is it slander? It's true. They didn't bow down to the image. But what is the point there? If the king told the Chaldeans to bow down to the image, then wasn't it their job, if they were going to bow down to the image, to bow down to the image and mind their own business? Because had they truly bowed down to the image and had their mind on their business, then how would they have even known that anybody was still standing? What does that tell you? They must have been looking around. They weren't just keeping their mind on their image of the beast business. They were making sure everybody else was worshiping the beast the same way that they were. And if they found somebody who looked different, who behaved differently, rather than minding their own business and saying, you know what, I did my job. I did what the king told me to do. Instead, they chose to slander the Jews, to bring accusations, to bring charges. And, as a parent, if you have multiple children, you know what this feels like when siblings tell on one another. And sometimes they'll tell stories on each other and like, no, wait a minute, how do you know? What were you doing when so-and-so did this? And that would have been my first question to the Chaldeans, like, well, how do you know they didn't bow? What were you doing? However, we want to look at exactly what they were doing. When it uses this word kratz, it's going to be Aramaic, and it does correspond to a Hebrew word with the same shoresh, kratz. But it doesn't just mean to bring an accusation. It literally means to chew somebody up, to eat them. If you've ever heard like a juicy tidbit of gossip, it makes it sound like it's a snack or something. Well, that's kind of biblical. Because when you bring an accusation against somebody, when you slander someone, the the symbolism of it is that you ate their flesh. And that's why I wanted to put the Strong's and Gesenius entry on there, so that you could see how it means to eat anyone's flesh. You're eating them alive. And so if we put this back into our statement here, don't stare at me, don't gaze at me because I'm swarthy, because I'm black, because I'm sunburned. What you see here is that she is perceived as an outsider. And they're really kind of standing in between two places. The right thing to do would be to say, let me understand why she looks the way that she does. She's obviously been on a different journey. And she's about to tell me why. So let me just not make any prejudgments here. And let me hear her case. Let me hear it objectively. But see, because of the look on their faces, she knows that they could just as easily chew her to pieces. They could just as easily slander her and eat her flesh. The idea here is there's things these gazers, these lookers, they don't know about her yet. And that's what all she's really saying here is, let me explain myself. Let me explain the way that I look to you before you start consuming my flesh with your mouth. Let's just stop it at the look here. And if you're going to look, then at least listen to my story. So let's go back a little bit. Let's go back to Moses. And probably there's nobody other than Yeshua in the history of Israel who loved Israel so much that he was willing to put up with their complaining, their rebelliousness, their depression, their plots, their covetousness, their all these things, their impatience. Through all of that, Moses nursed them through 40 years in the wilderness. That's love, because he was only human like we are. We can imagine. Oh my goodness, I can't imagine. They left with 600,000 men. So I don't know how many millions that would have equated to. And these are people who were not used to being free. They're used to being servants to Pharaoh. They're used to living in the confines of death and deathly thinking. They are a bit sunburned by what they've been through. And Moses does an almost flawless job. Now, before he really takes on the job, he makes a mistake. And he's kind of warned. You need to be careful how you speak about these people. Yes, they're going to be sunburned. Yes, they've been living in a land of idolatry. Yes, they've been building storage cities for Pharaoh. Yes, they've been leading bitter lives, and they're going to be bitter people because of it. But when Moses says they won't listen to me, he says, okay, stick your hand in your cloak. And so when Moses does that, he pulls his hand out and it's leprous. And if you remember, one of the primary causes of leprosy is evil speech, slander. Remember Miriam? He says, don't forget what happened to Miriam in the wilderness. Okay, don't forget what happened to Moses before he took on the job. He saw right up front what the penalty could be for slandering people when the words were probably true. They did have difficulty hearing Moses, but it didn't mean that ultimately their ears wouldn't tune in, that ultimately they wouldn't follow him out. And so he's like, the warning is, Moses, you got to be careful. Be careful how you speak about these people. Now stick your hand back in your cloak, stick your hand back in your bosom, pull it out. Now you're healed. But be careful. And Moses is just almost flawless after that, until Miriam dies. And it's like he did forget about what happened to Miriam. When she talked about his relationship with the Cushite woman, she and Aaron apparently were slandering. Whether they intended to slander or not, they did. And then she had to be put out of the camp for 7 days because she had turned leprous. And so Moses had to intercede. And it's like, he did forget, even though he said, don't forget. He knows what the message is. Don't forget what happened to Miriam. She dies, and immediately he forgets. Because they run out of water when Miriam dies. And it says Moses and Aaron are talking to the people, and then it says it goes into singular. But we know when it's singular, he's speaking for both of them, because Aaron also cannot cross over the Jordan for the same reason. He said to them, listen now, you rebels, shall we bring forth water for you? And right there, he could not cross over Jordan. That was it. He wasn't going to cross over with them because he did not sanctify the name of the Most High. And this is when we have to be careful. We tend to make these sorts of mistakes. We tend to slander the servants of the Most High when we are sad, when we're angry, when we're anxious, when we're confused, when we're depressed, when we're frustrated. That's when these words just kind of pop out. And it just popped out on Moses. He forgot. And he forgot who actually makes the water come out. For once, he moves the attention away from the Holy One. He ceases to see himself as the sent one and sees himself as the source. Just this one time. But man, the penalty. I mean, think you put up with everything you just called them is true, Moses. They are rebels. But you're not allowed to say this. Not in this context. Shall we bring forth water for you? He and Aaron got themselves confused with the Holy One. They perceived them as rebelling against Moses and Aaron. Not so much against the Holy One. Because remember, earlier they said, who are we? Who is Aaron that you would, be angry with him? You're mad at the Most High. And in this one case, they make a mistake. And out of their frustration, like, are these people never going to get it right? They make this mistake, and then they can't cross over the Jordan. And so the words were actually true. They were rebels. They were everything that Moses and Aaron could call them. But the question is, when you speak these words, who is it serving? We can misuse truth, because truth should always serve the purposes and the glory of the Holy One. If at any point the truth is only serving our purposes and serves to glorify us, then we have come into dangerous ground. And this is not the only example. This is just kind of the warm-up example. It goes on and it analyzes Elijah as another example of this. And Elijah was such an important prophet that Jewish tradition identifies him as the prophet who's going to herald the impending arrival of Messiah. Some sources will say 3 days before Messiah comes, Elijah will proclaim him. And Yeshua even refers to it. When they ask him in Matthew 17, 10 through 12, he doesn't deny that that's the way that it's going to be. He even says, well, if you can accept it, Elijah's already come. The spirit of Elijah has been coming through the earth, through John the Baptist. That same preaching, that same message of repentance. And Elijah he was the champion of repentance, of turning back, of rebuking, of exhorting. But see, what a prophet has to do is a prophet cannot confuse himself with the word that has been put in his mouth. That's what happened with Moses and Aaron. For once, they confused themselves with the source. And the words that came out of their mouths were true, but they weren't put in their mouths to speak. And I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to scare me, okay? Because we do, as the time draws near, we know that plagues are upon us. And if we know plagues are upon us, then we have to examine ourselves. We have to kind of fill the role of the priest, so we don't have a functioning priesthood. We have to go back to the Torah. We have to go back to Leviticus. And we have to take those instructions and look inside ourselves and say, am I guilty of slander? If so, then let me deal with that. Let me learn how to not confuse myself with the Holy One and the words that he would put in my mouth for his purposes and for his glory. Let me never misdirect them to myself. Let them never be to elevate my position relative to somebody else, to displace someone else. And so it says in 1 Kings 19, 9 through 10, and you probably want to read the whole chapter if you want to go back and look at the full context. But in 1 Kings 19, it says, then he came there. Remember, he's just had this run-in with Jezebel, and she's like, I'm going to kill you. I kill you. It says he came there to a cave and lodged there. And he's, if you remember, he was actually headed to Horeb, to the mountain. And so it says, behold, the word of the Lord came to him. And he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? Or Eliyahu? He said, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. Now, there's only one misstatement in that entire answer. And he says it twice, by the way. If you go on down through the chapter, he'll restate it. What is wrong here is, or clearly wrong, is, and I alone am left. He's not the only one who's left. There's 7,000 more who were left in the land, who have not bowed a knee to Baal or kissed him. And so one of these statements is kind of blended in with the truth, which might make us question whether his first statement is actually true. We know for sure that the sons of Israel in general had forsaken the covenant. We know that in general, they had torn down the altars. We know in general, they had killed the prophets. But it didn't include every single child of Israel. It didn't. There were 7,000 who had never bowed the knee to Baal. And 7 is like a perfect number. So let's go back to his first statement. He says, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. Has he? Yes, he has. But is it possible at some point his zeal for the Lord kind of got all mixed up with his zeal for his own ministry? Because at this point, remember, he's on the run. He's running from Jezebel. If you see Jezebel, run. She's a bad woman. But he says, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. I would say that that's at least partially true. But is there a point where he's mixed himself up, his own sense of self-preservation, and pinned Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh on it? He says, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, the God of hosts. And then he says, and they seek my life to take it away. And they do, but not everybody. And see, this is the danger. If you ever catch yourself talking about this nebulous they, well, they're all out to get us. Well, it's, you never actually name a person, but it's just they're out to get me. The system. Well, there are systems that the dragon and the beast do use, but we have to be very careful, because if you see what Elijah said here, they seek my life to take it away. Who's trying to take Elijah's life? As far as we can tell, Jezebel, because you get rid of Jezebel, all the spirit's going to go out of him. He's already had this showdown with the prophets of Baal. And if it weren't for this one queen who's executing the wishes of her husband, then really the resistance is going to die out. But Elijah is seeing himself as the victim of they. They seek my life. What do you think those 7,000 and their families who had never bowed the knee to Baal, were they after him too? And this is important. When we're talking about somebody being after us, let's name them. Who is it? Why not just say Jezebel? Why not just say Ahab? Be specific, because the more you talk about they, the bigger you will perceive the group is that's after you. And at the end of this, Elijah finds out the number of his enemies is much greatly reduced than the number he was thinking. So what we have here is Elijah. He's holding up his own zeal. He's saying, this is the true walk in the covenant. They have broken your covenant. He slanders the children of Israel. He says they have forsaken your covenant. They have apostatized from your covenant and torn down the altars. And it's true. They had. A majority had. And so what the Midrash does is it tries to imagine an interaction. Like, we hear the question, okay, Elijah, what are you doing here? And we hear Elijah's answers. And so it offers, it's not saying this is what God said, it's saying, imagine this conversation, which helps us decipher what's going on inside of Elijah. And are we blaming Elijah for being human? No more than we're blaming Moses and Aaron for being human. There's a limit when you're human. We lose our tempers. We get frustrated. We feel betrayed. We feel all sorts of things because we are human. But we can learn. Because if great people like this can have this problem, that tells us that we are also susceptible. We are not above them in terms of righteousness. We have not conquered everything. These things are examples to us. And so the Midrash says, okay, what if this was interactive? Elijah says, they've broken your covenant. And so what if the Holy One's like, okay, it was my covenant that Israel has forsaken. Was it perhaps your covenant? Is that why you're so bent out of shape? Are you really that upset? Maybe it's your covenant and not mine? Should you be more upset about this than I am, in other words? And he says, well, they've broken your altars. And he says, well, yeah, they did destroy my altars. Were they your altars? Should you be more upset than me? Because you're wanting me to take vengeance on your enemies. But if I'm not as upset as you are that I'm ready to wipe everybody out. Let's think about this. And then he says, they killed your prophets with the sword. And they say, well, they were my prophets. And of what concern is that to you? Now that seems harsh because we're one body. If one part of the body is hurting, then we're all hurting. And that's not really the problem. Elijah should have been concerned that the prophets were being killed. The idea here is that his reaction tells us he's got himself all mixed up in this. And so what the Midrash, through like inserting these questions to make us think, these are rhetorical questions about what Elijah's saying, they're saying what maybe we should question is Elijah's motivation behind these accusations, because the accusations are true. Until you get down to the bottom where he thinks he's the only one. But we know at this point he's alone, he's scared, he's tired, he's anxious, he's confused, he's angry, he's feeling betrayed, like I've done everything I've been asked to do and this is what I get. And it seems like his lowest emotional point, the father says, well, this is a teachable moment, Elijah. I can teach you something. And you're thinking, oh, my father, we're only human. Why would you wait until he was at his lowest point? He was a great servant. And he's at his lowest point. And it's like, cheer up, it gets worse. And that's why I tell you, when you feel like you're low, cheer up, it's going to get worse. But we'll be here to hold your hand while you're going through it. He's teaching him a lesson here about words and comparisons when we feel strong emotions. See, if we can stop it at the gaze. I mean, you ever run into somebody and it was the last straw? And you gave them the look. And they're looking back at you like, I know I've just hit a button or flipped a switch or something, but I'm not sure when I'm getting the reaction I'm getting. And the lesson here is don't say it. Don't say it. Don't even look at them like that. Just get some space. Just get some space before the gaze, before the look turns into words. And then when we lose our temper and we say words that, yes, they might be true, but we shouldn't have said them. And then to make ourselves feel better, instead of admitting, I shouldn't have said that, we'll start comparing ourselves to other people. Well, yeah, I said that, but I didn't do what so-and-so did. Or I didn't do anything as bad as they did. Comparisons don't work in a heavenly court. You don't go into a heavenly court and start comparing yourself to everybody else. That's not a defense. That's not even an offense. And even Uzi agrees. So Elijah goes through it again. In verse 14, he repeats every one of those accusations. And he tells us he feels like he's alone, like he's the only faithful Israelite and they're trying to kill him. This is how low he is. But yet he still needs to learn not to confuse himself with the Holy One. He's kind of in the position of Moses and Aaron. You're doing my work, but don't ever confuse doing my work with being me. That's the message that the Holy One is sending him. And so in verse 6, what precedes this is a hint. It says, he looked up, and behold, near his head was a cake of ritzafim. Ritzafim. And that means something, that has context. The ritzef, it's like they would get a cooking stone red hot. And then you've probably seen this on cooking shows from the Middle East or India. They'll take the cake or the flatbread, if you want to call it that, and they'll throw it on that hot stone, and it'll just puff right up for baking. And then you'll have a nice, I would say tortilla, but it's a flatbread, whatever. So this is a detail that we don't need. We don't need to know how the cake was baked. We just need to know that there was food there was a cake there. Instead, it tells us exactly what kind of stone was there. It was a ritzef. And so that tells us it's somehow related to Elijah's predicament. And it does have context, and it has context in the book of Isaiah. We get more information about what that ritzef, that red hot stone or coal, symbolized. And here's what Isaiah says in Isaiah 6, 5-7. Isaiah says, woe is me, for I am ruined, because I am a man of unclean lips. And I think it would have been fine if he'd stopped right there. But he didn't. I mean, he's up before the throne. I mean, you talk about marching into the throne room and being careful what comes out of your mouth. If you just march into the throne room and you have an audience with the king, I think stopping with, I am a person of unclean lips is fine. But he goes on, he says, I live among a people of unclean lips. Well, now he's speaking on behalf of other people. He's speaking words that have not been put into his lips. See, that there came a point with Elijah where he was speaking words that had not been put in his mouth. And these were words of accusation. These were words that were going up into the heavenly court. Now, had the heavenly court put the words in his mouth, it would be completely different. But he's inserting words that didn't need to be said. It was a truth that he wasn't asked for. And it was a truth that mixed in his own fears with what he was saying. So Isaiah says, I live among a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a burning coal. Ritzpah, it's from Ritzafim. Ritzpah, in his hand, which he had taken from the altar with tongs. He touched my mouth with it and said, behold, this has touched your lips, and your iniquity is taken away, and your sin is forgiven. And so the scholars look at this and they say, well, is this ritzpah, is this coal, is it only for Isaiah's sin? Or is it for accusing Israel before the throne? He's calling them a people of unclean lips. And this is what we mean about having to be so careful, because it's one thing for Isaiah to confess his own sin, but was it necessary at that point, before the words had been put in his mouth, to slander the children of Israel for what they were doing? And they were doing a bunch. In fact, he's about to receive the words. The words are going to be put in his mouth. These rebukes are going to be put in his mouth. But it's not our job to speak them before they come through divine utterance. And if you continue reading in Isaiah, yes, it's extensive prophecy. It's extensive rebuke of Israel. In fact, way worse than what Isaiah had just said. Nevertheless, the ritzpah, he had to have the ritzpah on his lips. And this is what words are. They can be like burning coals. But that's the difference. Isaiah offered slander, which was true. However, what he receives afterward to speak to the people comes from a heavenly source. He's submitting himself to the will of heaven and speaking those rebukes. There was no mistaking. He wasn't mixing up himself with the prophecy of rebuke that he's given. And so they point out, because of this ritzpah and the fact that Elijah is faced with that particular stone or coal, that they say the common word for coal is chelet. And since the word ritzpah is substituted, or ritzapim in the case of Elijah, they're interpreting it as a contraction. And it's a contraction for the words rutz, which means to crush, and peh, which is mouth, ritzpeh. And normally it's written rishpeh. It says the change in spelling indicates that there is a secondary meaning here of rutzpeh. And it shows us this. I went ahead and pulled it up in the lexicon so you could see it, where how ritzef, like the ritzafim, the coal, is for reshef. It's an equivalent expression to reshef. So what's happening here? Does that mean that we should never repent on behalf of others? Like the prayers, like the vidui. You know, we have done this, we have done that. Well, number one, that's an inclusive. You see yourself as part of a collective. You're not standing alone in prayer. But again, what is the motivation? What is the purpose behind that prayer? Can we never repent on behalf of our fathers, the sins of our fathers? Well, yeah, there's a scriptural pattern that we should. Even if we didn't do it, if our ancestors did it, there's precedent in scripture for us to ask forgiveness on their behalf, because the residue does come down. Should we never ask forgiveness for our nation? Should we never ask for mercy for the sins of our nation? No, we should. We should. But what we have to discern when we stand before the Holy One, and there is a sign in almost every Orthodox synagogue somewhere, if you know where to look for it, it will say, know before whom you stand, because you stand in prayer. You need to know before whom you're standing. And you need to evaluate the prayer. Am I praying this prayer, and have I somehow delighted in mentioning the sins of others and felt good that I didn't do those sins? Yeah, I did this little thing over here, but I'm just so glad that I'm not an adulterer. I'm just so glad that I'm not a thief. I'm just so glad that I'm not Yeshua taught us about this. When we stand in prayer and we start confessing sins on behalf of other people, which we would call, in a way, intercession, it needs to be honest intercession. We should never confuse ourselves and just simply insert ourselves in place of the Holy One. So the point of showing the similarity and the lexicon between retzafim, the hot coals, and the reshafim is because the Reshapim give us a really good context for why we should be really, 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 really careful when we speak about other people, especially the children of Israel, before the Holy One. It says in the Song of Songs, and I forgot to put the reference on there, I think it might be chapter 5. He says, or she says, put me like a seal over your heart, like a seal on your arm. For love is as strong as death. Jealousy is as severe as Sheol. Its flashes, and there again, there's the Reshapim are flashes, Reshapim of fire, the very flame of the Lord. And that tells us exactly why truth is not always enough. Just speaking the truth, some people think, should never be wrong. But we have examples of when it was wrong. If it's used to slander the beloved of Adonai, for whom he is very jealous in spite of their rebelliousness, or like our beloved that we're about to hear her explanation of, she's been burned by the sun. She's been in a type of exile. When you're out in exile, you can become ignorant of things. You can have the pressures of Egypt. You can have the pressures of Babylon. You can have the pressures of Rome. And so you may not come out smelling like a rose. But what is that to us? Shouldn't we hear her story? Shouldn't we allow her to introduce herself and why she does look different? Because if we slander his beloved, it says his love is as strong as death. His jealousy is severe as Sheol, the grave. She might be everything you're accusing her of. She might be. But there may be more to her story that you don't know yet. And so live another day to hear more of her story, because like Proverbs says, don't slander the servant to the master, because he's going to come after you. He loves her. He's jealous over her. So I wanted to give you this context, which seems like it's just straight out of this midrash, by the way. It's John 21:20. And the phrase we're working here, and this is where it seems like we can figure out what's going on with Elijah. It says, now they seek to take my life, which really clarifies what's going on with him. He's not as upset about their departing from the covenant. He's not as upset about their tearing down the altars and putting the other prophets to the sword as he is about the fact that they want to take his life. He says, my life. And that's what the questions are all about. Elijah, you're afraid for your life. Don't mix that up with my purposes. These are my people. And you are the instrument. You are the messenger. You speak the words I put in your mouth. But Elijah has such a important job, not just at that point in history, but his job is continuing. He will be a part of our future. When the Messiah comes, he's a big part of that. And this was something that needed to be cleared up. So it says Peter, and remember, Peter has this conversation with Yeshua after, he's had he had a bad time. When Yeshua got arrested, things didn't go well for Peter. He wasn't as big and tough as he thought he was. And so he's broken after that. And remember, Yeshua asks him 3 times, Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Do you love me? And it just broke Peter's heart. But we can see the dynamic right here in John 21. It says, Peter turning around saw, remember, don't gaze at me because I'm dark. Don't gaze at me in this manner where you're kind of between judging me and hearing me out. That there might be a plan you're not aware of. There might have been a journey you didn't know about. There might have been a journey you weren't called to, so don't judge it. But it says, Peter turning around saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who also had leaned back on his bosom at the supper and said, Lord, who's the one who betrays you? So Peter seeing him, see the context there? This disciple, who's apparently John, doesn't really have his mind on his own business. He says, which one is it? Instead of saying, Lord, I don't want to betray you, whoever this was says, who is it? Just like the Chaldeans. Well, look, they didn't bow down. Well, how do you know they didn't bow down? Were you looking around? Lord, who's the one who betrays you? So Peter, seeing him, see what happened? He saw him. He gazed at him. Said to Yeshua, Lord, and what about this man? What about him? Yeshua said to him, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. Therefore, and this shows you how stuff gets started, how juicy morsels get out there. Therefore, this saying went out among the brethren, that disciple would not die. Yet Yeshua did not say to him that he would not die, but only, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? I'm going to set him on his journey. And I'm going to set you on your journey. You just follow me. You follow me. Don't worry about what he's doing. He's not your disciple. He's not your servant. He's my servant. He's my disciple. Don't worry about him. And so, what happened to Elijah? If we keep reading in chapter 19 and verse 16, it kind of breaks your heart because there's going to be a regime change. It says, Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah, you shall anoint as prophet in your place. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. So the end of the conversation is, well, you know what, Elijah, it's been great. So now I want you to go anoint your replacement. It's like, nope, you can't slander my people. You can't confuse yourself with me. You only speak the words I put in your mouth. When you know you are speaking harsh words against somebody, it needs to be a divine utterance. It needs to be an act of obedience for a specific purpose, such as testimony. Because that in a court situation, the person has the opportunity to hear the accusation and to answer the accusation with facts you may not have been aware of, which is what the beloved is trying to say. Listen to my story. So when we feel ourselves doing that, and I'm talking to myself tonight, when we feel ourselves forming an accusation against people, we really need to hit those brakes hard. Is this person or this group of people I'm talking about, does the Father love them in spite of their appearance? They've been on a different journey than mine. They look a little foreign to me. Their mannerisms are a little foreign. But there's things about them I probably don't know. Just like Elijah didn't know that he's a prophet, but he still didn't know that 7,000 people never bent their knees to the Baals, which goes back to Ritzpeh, crush the mouth. As great as Elijah's faith was, he needed to crush his mouth and have greater faith in the Father's remnant, or more properly, in the Father's ability to bring his remnant in and to deal with their sunburn, as he's dealing with all our sunburns. So the pattern of the complaint is telling us we should be aware, we should be careful about comparing ourselves to somebody else, especially somebody else who is a servant of the Holy One. And these were all true. They've forsaken the covenant. They tore down the altars. They killed the prophets. Yes, every single one of those things is true, and they're not light. In fact, if I were God, I'd probably want to destroy them, but we're not God. And then Elijah gets to it. They're trying to take my life. That's why I'm so upset. And I'm mixing up being upset on your behalf with being upset on my behalf. And so the Midrash kind of sums it up and says, of course, Elijah was expected to rebuke those who sin. However, here, Elijah's actually asking God to avenge himself upon the Israelites. You are expected to speak to those who sin. You need to be really careful, though, about marching into the throne room with your accusation. Make sure you don't have yourself all mixed up in there. Because sometimes in speaking truth, we are not truthful about why we're speaking it. Is it truly the Holy One's interests we have at heart? And if so, do we remember how he feels about his children, that he loves them and he's jealous over them? Or do we sometimes inadvertently, and I got my hand raised on that one as guilty, do we inadvertently put ourselves in his position, demanding justice, not truly because he's Elohim, but because we fear for our own lives, our own safety, our own well-being, or maybe positions in the kingdom, or worse yet, do we covet somebody else's position? Is pointing out the truth just a way of magnifying how much better we are? See, it takes a lot of soul searching if we're going to put words to what's behind our gaze. So next week, we'll look at we'll hear her story. What's your story? We're not going to think anything bad about you yet. We're going to suspend judgment, and we want to hear what's happened between you and the son. We're going to hear you out. We're not going to look at you contemptuously. We're not going to speak slanderous words about you. We're going to reserve judgment. Tell us your story.